and welcome to the Safri Private Wealth Podcast. I'm Leonora Stevens, a private wealth partner based in Bristol. I'm joined by Mike Hodges, a fellow private wealth partner based in our Manchester office. Hello, Mike.
Hi, Leo.
Today, we have perhaps one of our most frequent guest speakers, Alex Britton-Davis, a tax partner in our London office. Welcome back, Alex.
Hi, Leo. Hi, Mike.
Hiya.
Join us each episode for in-depth discussions on private wealth matters, from estate planning and trust to retirement and gifting strategies. We're here to provide practical tips to help grow and protect your wealth. Also, please don't forget to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform. So what is the topic of our discussions today? Well, listeners may guess that whenever we have Alex as a guest, there is usually an international element to our discussions, but not least because I'm sure people will also have read the title of the podcast before clicking to listen to it. Today, we're going to talk about the impact of the non-dom reforms on those people wanting to retire abroad. You may be listening to this and think, well, I've been living in the UK for years. I may consider retiring overseas in, say, 5 to 10 years, but I've never been non-domiciled. So why does this apply to me? Well, you should listen, as the change in the non-dom rules have actually improved the position for those wishing to retire and see out their days overseas. Alex, would you like to start by summarising what the implications of the change in the non-dom rules are for UK domiciled individuals?
Yes, so people have probably heard of the term non-dom, definitely in the press. It was in the lead up to the election, was mentioned a lot. And what it really refers to is someone whose sort of permanent home isn't in the UK, but is overseas. So that might be someone who's just come here temporarily for a few years to live here, to work maybe whilst their kids are at school, but they actually plan to, return back to their home country or elsewhere overseas. They're non-domiciled because their permanent home isn't in the UK. And the reason why that used to matter is this was what was used to determine whether someone's worldwide assets were within the scope of inheritance tax. It's the reason why, someone who lives in Australia and has never set foot in the UK doesn't have to pay UK inheritance tax on their assets. But it also affected how you could be taxed on your income and capital gains worldwide as well as inheritance tax. So those non-doms in the UK wouldn't be paying inheritance tax or income tax on capital gains on foreign assets, foreign income and gains. That's all changing, and we're getting rid of domicile as a concept for taxation. So quite a major change.
Okay, and so what about the announcements that were made last year? So how would that change those people thinking about retiring overseas who are UK sort of long-term nationals?
Yeah, so we're getting rid of domicile as the relevant concept and replacing it with this concept of long-term residence for inheritance tax. So instead of saying, where are you domiciled? The question is, are you long-term UK resident? Now, the test for that is whether you've been UK resident in 10 or more of the previous 20 years. And so that could be quite relevant for people leaving the UK if they're going to be gone for more than 10 years. In 10 years' time, they'll no longer meet that test, and then they'll fall outside of the scope of inheritance tax, except with regards to their UK assets, which will always be subject to inheritance tax.
A potential client was thinking of moving overseas. What might they have overseas? I mean, I know we said the UK assets, but have you got any examples of where it might be beneficial for a client?
Yeah, let's say we've got an individual, they've always worked in the UK, they've got their UK family home, they've got investments, etc. here, maybe they've got a pension pot, they might be a business owner with a UK business, they move overseas, let's say, south of Spain, they buy a nice villa out there. So number one, that villa would be a non-UK asset, so that after 10 years, they wouldn't be paying inheritance tax on that. Maybe their children, grandchildren are still in the UK, so they want to keep a UK property. That will still be subject to inheritance tax. Those investments, you might say, well, we could have UK bank accounts, or we could move those over to Spain as well, or we could put them somewhere else. We could start investing outside the UK so that those are non-UK assets, and then those would also fall outside the scope of UK taxation. Things like pensions might be a little bit trickier to manage because a UK pension fund will be a UK asset, and those are falling within the scope of inheritance tax from 2027. as long as the government do follow through with that policy they announced. So there's it doesn't get rid of your inheritance tax liability completely, but it does mean that those foreign assets, particularly if you're going to live outside the UK, you're more likely to start acquiring foreign assets than UK assets. Those will fall outside the scope.
The other one I was going to say, which I troubled Alex with earlier in the week, was a client of mine who has been out of the UK for a long time. Until this April, you're worrying about the domicile rules, which are extremely complicated and vague. And now you're saying, right, we've got a bright line test that says, right, if you can tick off your residence, then it's easy. So it's not just people going; it's some of those people who've already gone who suddenly have got clarity which they didn't have before.
Absolutely. I think the clarity of the test is going to be really valuable to people. People like having certainty. They don't like having uncertainty, particularly when you're talking about things that will happen after their death. People don't want to leave their children to worry about these things. They want that certainty. So knowing that it's 10 years and you've got certainty on the rule is really valuable. I actually have a client who's never lived in the UK, but had uncertainty about his domicile because his father was Scottish. That's the sort of thing where you know, people never would have expected him to be paying inheritance tax. He never lived here, but he did have that uncertainty. So it's nice to be able to provide clarity to people and give them a definite test.
I think also, though, it's all very well saying you're reducing your UK IHT exposure, but if you then start moving all your assets to a different country, you know, you still need to consider what the local taxes would be in that country if you were to die there, and what the implications, because it might be worse than here. Or it might, so, you know, it's always working out what the options are before you do it, if you're just trying to sort of mitigate your UK exposure. And I mean, Alex, have you seen from your experience, are there locations that are popular when it comes to low IHT jurisdictions?
Yeah, absolutely. And inheritance tax and estate tax are some of the taxes that vary the most throughout the world. So a lot of countries simply don't have any. So that's nice and simple. You go somewhere they don't have an inheritance tax. That means you won't pay anything. Some countries have an estate tax or gift tax, and it's more generous than the UK. Maybe it's a lower rate, or maybe it's somewhere like the US where the allowance is just much, much higher. So you can gift a lot more property without paying the tax. And then other places like France are sort of reasonably, you could describe as maybe slightly stricter, because they look at both the residence of the person giving away the asset, but also the person receiving the asset. So yeah, it varies hugely. So it's really important to understand the rules where you're moving, but also understand how they work differently to the UK, because if you're used to the UK system, the chances are there's going to be some differences which you're going to have to get the hang of.
I suppose, and also for the recipient, as you just identified, that in some places they look at the residency of the recipients. But so, say for example, you move overseas and there's no IHT on your estate. I suppose the beneficiaries would want to know what the implications for them are, aren't they? Whether if the funds are then remitted back to the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. So generally, if the beneficiaries are staying in the UK, maybe it's their children, grandchildren who are still here, that should be straightforward. We tax the person giving away the assets, not the person receiving them. But if you do have children, grandchildren elsewhere, definitely worth checking what their tax position would be.
And I suppose also it's making sure, as we've said, UK assets are still subject to UK inheritance tax. So even if you move overseas and you have a lovely house in London and you die holding that, that would still be subject to IHT. But you would still get your nil rate bands, even if you went, if it's still available, obviously.
Yeah, exactly.
Do you think that people are going to start looking to move assets overseas as they start to retire abroad? Would there be any tax implications of them, for example, moving their portfolio from London to Switzerland, or would they have any exit taxes to think about?
So we don't have exit taxes for individuals in the UK. So some countries do. If you sort of cease to be resident or within the scope of taxation, you sort of have a deemed disposal of all of your assets and you pay capital gains tax. We have rules like that for trusts and companies, but not for individuals. So there isn't an exit tax per se, but obviously if all of your assets are UK assets and you want to stop that being the case, you might need to dispose of those. So your UK home, now maybe initially you would get main residence relief on any gain, but if you've left the UK already, there probably would be some capital gains tax to pay on a disposal. Similarly, if you did own a UK business, you would probably need to dispose of that. So, and although if you're non-resident, you might not be paying tax in the UK. Would you be paying tax on that capital gain in the country where you've moved to? So you would definitely need to, we would normally suggest getting advice both in the UK and the other jurisdiction before the move, working out a plan to move some of those assets, working out when you're going to do so. So you can do it in a tax efficient way. And what you certainly don't want to do is trigger double charges somehow under the rules in both jurisdictions.
I think from a practical perspective, though, we're talking about moving overseas and starting to shift your assets overseas. If, for example, you've got mum and dad moving abroad, but their kids and their grandkids are still in the UK, they still need to consider that there are rules about residency, and if they are moving abroad to mitigate that tax, then they need to think about the implications on the number of days they can come to the UK, and it is weighing up the lifestyle choice of that as to whether that's worth it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We always say don't let the tax tail wag the dog. If you're thinking of moving somewhere for your retirement, you've worked hard, you want to enjoy it, you don't want to be miserable because you'd rather be back in the UK, seeing your grandchildren grow up, etc. But I think the key is finding somewhere which you like, which you would want to live in long term, that maybe just has a slightly more favourable tax treatment. As I say, there's a lot of places with no inheritance tax, and you'd pay the exact same income tax, capital gains tax rates. And you might say, yeah, that's great for me. Some people might say, no, I'm going to try and pay as little as possible and, move to a little island in the middle of the ocean somewhere. But it's all about personal choices. And, at the end of the day, we can't tell you where to move to because it has to be somewhere that suits you.
I did have a client who moved to New Zealand, and one of the attractive features, this was many years ago, one of the attractive features for him was no death duties. He had also found a Kiwi that he'd married, so that's half the story, or more than half the story. You would like to think it's not just a tax planning thing. Equally, Leo, being based in the north of England, the Isle of Man has tax attractions to it. But I have said to people in the past, November, December, January in the Isle of Man might not be quite as exotic as some of the sunnier climes that people could go to. So again, you're not just looking to make a tax decision, are you?
Exactly. It's just weighing it all up in the round as to what's your objective. Well, it comes back to what we always say: what is your objective, and and then how to shape that in the best way that works for you and your family, incorporating obviously all the different tax rules.
Definitely.
And I think also looking at the inheritance rules and the rounds, some European jurisdictions have forced heirship rules that might sort of prevent you from being able to fully choose how you dispose of your assets. So things like that are really important to discuss and make a plan well in advance to cover.
That actually reminds me that if you do have assets overseas, you should also have a will in the countries where those assets are as well, to direct where you want those to go.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Really
That's
important.
awesome. Wow. Great. Well, that was a quick whistle stop tour. So thank you, Alex and Mike. At Safri, we work with a wide range of clients, both in the UK and overseas. We advise individuals and families on how best to safeguard, maintain, and enhance their wealth, and on the most appropriate methods of passing on that wealth to the next generation. We also help people comply with the tax laws in the UK, which can be complex. It's important for me to mention that if you're considering any of the topics discussed today, you must always take professional advice based on your own circumstances. If you'd like to find out more about the services we offer at Safri, then please do visit our website at www.safri.com. And don't forget to subscribe on your preferred podcast platform and leave us a review if you found this episode helpful. Thank you for listening.